Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Library Socialist Book Club reading of the next chapter of Post-Scarcity Anarchism. We have got a rotating crew of book club readers, members of the book club on the Seriously Wrong Discord, who come and join us to do readings
Socialist
on
book club
Thursdays of the next chapter of Post-Scarcity Anarchism. We have got
I've somehow created an echo of myself on the stream
readers, members of the book club on the Seriously Wrong Discord, who come and join us to do readings on Thursdays of the next chapter.
Doing stuff
of
live is
Post-Scarcity
just
Anarchism.
so much more intense than
somehow created an echo of myself.
pre-recorded.
Readers,
So it's
members of the
good.
book club,
Hopefully
on the
our
Seriously Wrong
listeners are
Discord,
compassionate.
who come and readings on
book club.
So
I can't figure out where this echo is coming from. Oh, man. No, it's everything is coming through as an echo. We're going to go back to the music until I can figure out where this is coming from, because it is driving me wild. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out. There must be somewhere where the audio.
Reject domination, destroy the state, cap or its occupation.
Hey folks, I am back and seeing whether or not... Yeah, there's some sort of problem with my program, so I'm going to have to restart the whole stream, folks. But be back soon. Hey everyone, welcome back to the fully functional and working Library of Socialist Book Club stream, which totally makes sense and went off without a hitch. We figured out the issue. There's something being patched through our Discord mysteriously through someone who was muted, but we are no longer doing that, so now everything's hunky-dory, it's perfect, and you know that you can take our analysis seriously because one-to-one knowing political things to being able to stream effortlessly is sort of like a mathematical equation that it's a social truth of the universe that people who are better at streaming are also better at politics. So our extreme high quality of streaming shows our extreme high quality of politics. So the Library Socialist Book Club it's a book club we run through a Discord, and every week we do a reading where we go over a text together and read through it, and then the next week, the following Wednesday, we meet up and discuss the text, ask questions about the text and each other, have conversations. It goes for a couple hours. It's a lot of fun and managed through the Seriously Wrong Patreon, but if you're not a Patreon subscriber to the Seriously Wrong podcast, we don't want that to be a barrier to participating in the book club, including these streams. So feel free to ask for an invite to the book club if money's a barrier to you and you want to be involved in the reading or the discussion groups. So without further ado, we've got a handful of readers here today. We got Alicia, and we also have NMAS. To start, people might hop in as we go, hop in or out. It's a regular thing to do. We're going to be reading one page at a time, and we're going to be reading from the book Post-Scarcity Anarchism. And specifically, we're going to be reading the chapter called The May June Events in France, number 1, France, A Movement for Life, which was Bookchin's reflections on the May uprisings in France in 1968. So I'll just open up our copy of it on the screen here. Alicia, NMAS, do you want to briefly introduce yourselves?
Hey, I'm Alicia, and I am a regular reader on this thing, and I like it, and you should too, if you want. I think Endmass is still listening to the stream and not listening to the recording live part.
That makes perfect sense. Nmass is doing us a solid and making sure that our stream is coming through without issues.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good.
We're just at the part, Nmass, if you're here, where you introduce yourself briefly, and then we start reading.
I am Nmass. I read books, apparently. Don't really have much to say.
Love it. And Sean's gonna get started, I think, at the top of the chapter here.
Yeah, I've just added our book to the window there, and I flashed everyone my Discord sidebar by accident, so you can see, for example, that I'm in the Doomer versus Bloomer Discord server, as well as the R Communalism at Discord server, as well as the Seriously Wrong one. That's a little behind-the-scenes tidbit from my technological incompetence. So, without further ado, I will get started on reading the chapter this week. Let us begin. The May June events in France. 1. France, a movement for life. The quality of everyday life. The 1968 May June Uprising was one of the most important events to occur in France since the Paris Commune of 1871. Not only did it shake the foundations of bourgeois society in France, it raised issues and posed solutions of unprecedented importance for modern industrial society. It deserves the closest study and most thoroughgoing discussion by revolutionaries everywhere. The May June Uprising occurred in an industrialized, consumption-oriented country, less developed than the United States, but essentially in the same economic category. The uprising exploded the myth that the wealth and resources of the modern industrial society can be used to absorb all revolutionary opposition. The May June events showed that contradictions and antagonisms in capitalism are not eliminated by statification and advanced forms of industrialism, but changed in form and character. The fact that the uprising took everyone by surprise, including the most sophisticated theoreticians in the Marxist, situationist, and anarchist movements, underscores the importance of the May June events and raises the need to re-examine the sources of revolutionary unrest in modern society. The graffiti on the walls of Paris, power to the imagination, it is forbidden to forbid, life without dead times, never work, represents a more probing analysis of these sources than all the theoretical tomes inherited from the past. The uprising revealed that we are at the end of an old era and well into the beginning of a new one. The motive forces of revolution today, at least in the industrialized world, are not simply scarcity and material need, but also the quality of everyday life, the demand for the liberation of experience, the attempt to gain control over one's own destiny. It matters little that graffiti on the walls of Paris were initially scrawled by a small minority. From everything I've seen, it's clear that the graffiti, which now form the content of several books, have captured the imaginations of many thousands in Paris. They have touched the revolutionary nerve of the city.
The spontaneous majority movement. The revolt was a majority movement in the sense that it cut across nearly all the class lines in France. It involved not only students and workers, but technicians, engineers, and clerical people in nearly every stratum of the state, industrial, and commercial bureaucracy. It swept in professionals and laborers, intellectuals and football players, television broadcasters, and subway workers. It even touched the gendarmerie of Paris, and almost certainly affected the great mass of conscript soldiers in the French army. The revolt was initiated primarily by the young. It was begun by university students. Then it was taken up by young industrial workers, unemployed youth, and the, quote, leather jackets, the so-called delinquent youth of the cities. Special emphasis must be given to high school students and adolescents, who often showed more courage and determination than the university students. But the revolt swept in older people as well. Blue and white-collar workers, technicians, and professionals, although it was catalyzed by conscious revolutionaries, especially by anarchist affinity groups whose existence no one had even faintly supposed. The movement of the uprising was spontaneous. No one had, quote, summoned it forth. No one had organized it. No one had succeeded in, quote, controlling it. A festive atmosphere prevailed throughout most of the May-June days, an awakening of solidarity, of mutual aid, indeed of a selfhood and self-expression that had not been seen in Paris since the Commune. People literally discovered themselves and their fellow human beings anew, or remade themselves. In many industrial towns, workers clogged the squares, hung out red flags, read avidly, and discussed every leaflet that fell into their hands. A fever for life gripped millions, a reawakening of senses that people never thought they possessed, a joy and elation they never thought they could feel. Tongues were loosened, ears and eyes acquired a new acuity. There was singing with new and often ribald verses added to old tunes. Many factory floors were turned into dance floors. The sexual inhibitions that had frozen the lives of so many young people in France were shattered in a matter of days. This was not a solemn revolt, a coup d'etat bureaucratically plotted and manipulated by a vanguard party. It was witty, satirical, inventive, and creative, and therein lay its strength. Its capacity for immense self-mobilization, its infectiousness.
Many people transcended the narrow limitations that had impeded their social vision. For thousands of students, the revolution destroyed the prissy, tight-ass sense of, quote, studenthood, that privileged, pompous state that is expressed in America by the, quote, position paper and by the sociologies of the, quote, analytical document. The individual worker who came to the action committees at censor ceased to be, quote, workers as such. They became revolutionaries. And it is precisely on the basis of the new identity that people whose lives had been spent in universities, factories, and offices could meet freely, exchange experiences, and engage in common actions without any self-consciousness about their social, quote, origins or, quote, background. The revolt had created the beginnings of its own classless, non-hierarchical society. Its primary task was to extend this quantitatively new realm to the country at large, to every quarter of French society. Its hope lay in the extension of self-management in all its forms. The general assemblies and their administrative forms, the action committees, the factory strike committees, to all areas of the economy, indeed all areas of life itself. The most advanced consciousness of this task seems to have appeared so much among the workers in the more traditional industries where the communist-controlled CGT exercises great power, as among those in newer, more technically advanced industries such as electronics. Let me emphasize that the tentative conclusion drawn from a number of scattered but impressive episodes that were related to me by young militants in the student worker action committees.
Authority and hierarchy.
There we go.
Of paramount importance is the light that the May June revolt cast on the problem of authority and hierarchy. In this respect, it challenged not only the conscious processes of individuals, but also their most important unconscious, socially conditioned habits. It does not have to be argued at any great length that the habits of authority and hierarchy are instilled in the individual at the very outset of life, in the family milieu of infancy, in childhood education, at home and in school, in the organization of work, quote, leisure, and everyday life. This shaping of the character structure of the individual by what seems like archetypal norms of obedience and command constitutes the very essence of what we call the, quote, socialization of the young. The mystique of bureaucratic organization, of imposed formal hierarchies and structures, pervades the most radical movements and non-revolutionary periods. The remarkable susceptibility of the left to authoritarian and hierarchical impulses reveals the deep roots of the radical movement in the very society it professedly seeks to overthrow. In this respect, nearly every revolutionary organization is a potential source of counter-revolution. Only if the revolutionary organization is so structured that its forms reflect the direct decentralized forms of freedom initiated by the revolution, only if the revolutionary organization fosters in the revolutionists the lifestyles and personality of freedom, can this potential for counter-revolution be diminished. Only then is it possible for the revolutionary movement to dissolve into the revolution, to disappear into its new, directly democratic social forms like surgical thread into a healing wound. The act of revolution rips apart all the tendons that hold authority and hierarchy together in the established order. The direct entry of the people into the social arena is the very essence of revolution. Revolution is the most advanced form of direct action. By the same token, direct action in, quote, normal times is the indispensable preparation for revolutionary action. In both cases, there is a substitution of social action from below for political action within the established hierarchical framework. In both cases, there are molecular changes of, quote, masses, classes, and social strata into revolutionary individuals. This condition must become permanent if the revolution is to be successful. If it is not to be transformed into a counter-revolution masked by revolutionary ideology. Every formula, every organization, every tried and tested program must give way to the demands of the revolution. There is no theory, program, or party that has greater significance than the revolution itself.
Among the most serious obstacles to the May June Uprising were not only de Gaulle and the police, but also the hardened organizations of the left, the Communist Party that suffocated initiative in many factories, and the Leninist and Trotskyist groups that created such a bad odor in the General Assembly of the Sorbonne. I speak here not of the many individuals who romantically identified themselves with Che, Mao, Lenin, or Trotsky, often with all four at once, but of those who surrendered their entire identity, initiative, and volition to the tightly disciplined, hierarchical organizations. However well-intentioned these people may have been, it became their task to discipline the revolt, more precisely to de-revolutionize it by imbuing it with the habits of obedience and authority that their organizations have assimilated from the established order. These habits, fostered by participation in highly structured organizations modeled, in fact, on the very societies the, quote, revolutionaries profess to oppose, led to parliamentary maneuvering, secret caucusing, and attempts to control the revolutionary forms of freedom created by the revolution. They produced in the Sorbonne Assembly a poisonous vapor of manipulation. Many students to whom I spoke were absolutely convinced that these groups were prepared to destroy the Sorbonne Assembly if they could not, quote, control it. The groups were concerned not with the vitality of the revolutionary forms, but with the growth of their own organizations. Having created authentic forms of freedom in which everyone could freely express his viewpoint, the assembly would have been perfectly justified to have banned all bureaucratically organized groups from its midst.
It remains to the lasting credit of the March 22nd movement that it merged into the Revolutionary Assemblies and virtually disappeared as an organization, except in name. In its own assemblies, March 22nd arrived at all its decisions by the sense of the assembly, and it permitted all tendencies within its midst to freely test their views in practice. Such tolerance did not impair its, quote, effectiveness, this anarchic movement, by the common agreement of nearly all the observers. It did more to catalyze the revolt than any other student group. What distinguishes March 22nd and groups such as anarchists and situationists from all others is they work not for the, quote, seizure of power, but for its dissolution. The Dialectic of Modern Revolution. The French events of May and June reveal vividly and dramatically the remarkable dialectic of revolution. The everyday misery of society is highlighted by the possibilities for the realization of desire and freedom. The greater these possibilities, the more intolerable the everyday misery. For this reason, it matters little that French society has been more affluent in recent years than any other time in its history. Affluence's highly distorted bourgeois form merely indicates that the material conditions for freedom have developed, that the technical possibilities for new liberated life are overripe. It is plain now that these possibilities have haunted French society for a long time, even if unperceived by most people. The insensate consumption of good graphs in its own warped way, the tensions between the shabby reality of French society and the liberatory possibilities of our revolution today, just as sedating diet and extravagant obesity reveal the tensions in an individual. A time is finally reached when the diet of goods becomes tasteless, when the social obesity becomes intolerable. The breaking point is unpredictable. In the case of France, it was the barricades of May 10th, a day which shook the conscience of the entire country and posed the question to the workers. Quote, if the students, those children of the bourgeois, can do it, why can't we? End quote. It is clear that a molecular process was going on in France, completely invisible to most conscious revolutionaries, a process that the barricades participated in revolutionary action. After May 10th, the tension between the mediocrity of everyday life and the possibilities of a liberatory society exploded into the most massive general strike in history. The scope of the strike shows nearly all strata of French society were profoundly disaffected, and that the revolution was anchored not in a particular class, but in everyone who felt dispossessed, denied, cheated of life. The revolutionary thrust came from a stratum which, more than any other, should have, quote, accommodated itself to the existing order, the young. It was the young who had been nourished by the pap of Gauss, quote, civilization, who have not experienced the contrast between relatively attractive features of the pre-war civilization and the shabbiness of the new one. But pap didn't work. Its power to co-opt and absorb, in fact, is weaker than it was suspected by most critics of French society. The pap-fed society cannot withstand the drive for life, particularly in the young.
No less important, the lives of young people in France, as in America, has never been burdened by the Depression years and the quest for material security that shaped the lives of their elders. The prevailing reality of French life was taken by the young for what it is: shabby, ugly, egotistical, hypocritical, and spiritually annihilating. This single fact, the revolt of the young, is the most damning evidence of the system's inability to prevail on its own terms. The tremendous internal decay of Gaullist. How would you pronounce this, Alicia? Sorry if you're not ready to hop on mic. I just know that you got those French pronunciations. Gaullist.
Oh no, I think it's just de Gaulle. De Gaulle.
Gaullist Society.
I don't think you need to pronounce the S on this one. Just.
Can you hit me with it one more time? How would you say Gauit?
Sorry, I might have lost page where we are at in the text. But are you saying like de Gaulle, like the French guy?
Yes.
De Gaulle?
Oh yeah, and Bookchin saying like a de Gaulleist society. I think like the society of de Gaulle.
Yeah. There it is. Gaullist.
Gaullist. The tremendous
Sorry.
internal decay of Gaullist society, a decay long antedating the revolt itself, took forms that do not fit any of the traditional economically oriented formulas of, quote, revolution. Much had been written about consumerism in French society to the effect that it was a polluting form of social stabilization. The fact that objects, commodities, were replacing the traditional subjective loyalties fostered by the church, the school, the mass media, and the family should have been seen as evidence of a greater social decomposition than was suspected. The fact that traditional class consciousness was declining and the working class should have been evidence that conditions were maturing for a majority social revolution, not a minority class revolution. The fact that lumpen values in dress, music, art, and lifestyle were spreading among French youth should have been evidence that the potential for, quote, disorder and direct action was ripening beyond the facade of conventional public protest. By a remarkable twist of dialectic irony, a process of de-bourgeoisification was going on precisely when France had attained unprecedented heights of material affluence. Whatever may have been the personal popularity of de Gaulle, a process of deinstitutionalization was going on precisely when state capitalism seemed more entrenched in the social structure than at any time in recent past. The tension between drab reality and liberatory possibilities was increasing precisely when French society seemed more acquiescent than any time since the 1920s. Sometimes there's scanning typos. I'm going to assume it's that. A process of alienation was going on precisely when it seemed like the verities of bourgeois society were more secure than at any time in the history of the Republic. The point is that issues that make for social unrest had changed qualitatively. The problems of survival, scarcity, and renunciation had changed into those of life, abundance, and desire. The French dream, like the American dream, was eroding and becoming demystified. Bourgeois society had given all it could only on the terms it was capable of giving anything, a plethora of shabby material goods acquired by meaningless, deadening work. Experience itself, not vanguard parties or tried and tested programs, quote, tried and tested programs, became the mobilizing agent and source of creativity for the May June Uprising. And this is as it should be. Not only is it natural that an uprising breaks out spontaneously, a feature of all the great revolutions in history, but it is also natural that it unfolds spontaneously. This hardly means that revolutionary groups stand mute before events. If they have ideas and suggestions, it's their responsibility to present them. But to use the social forms created by the revolution for manipulatory purposes, to operate secretly behind the back of the revolution, to distrust it and try to replace it with the glorious party, is wantonly criminal and unforgivable. Either the revolution eventually absorbs all political organisms, or the political organisms become ends in themselves, the inevitable sources of bureaucracy, hierarchy, and human enslavement.
To diminish the spontaneity of a revolution, to break the continuum between self-mobilization and self-emancipation, to remove the self from the process in order to mediate it with political organizations and institutions borrowed from the past, is to vitiate the revolution's liberatory goals. If the revolution does not start from below, if it does not enlarge the, quote, base of society until it becomes the society itself, then it is a mere coup d'etat. If it does not produce a society in which each individual controls his daily life, instead of daily life controlling each individual, then it is a counter-revolution. Social liberation can only occur if it is simultaneously self-liberation, if the, quote, mass movement is a self-activity that involves the highest degree of individuation and self-awakening. In the molecular movement below that prepares the condition for revolution, in the self-mobilization that carries the revolution forward, in the joyous atmosphere that consolidates the revolution, in all of these successive steps, we have a continuum of individuation, a process in which power is dissolved, an expansion of personal experience and freedom almost aesthetically congruent with the possibilities of our time, to see this process and articulate it, to catalyze the process and pose the next practical tasks, to deal unequivocally with the ideological movements that seek to, quote, control the revolutionary process. These, as the French events have shown, are the primary responsibilities of the revolutionary today. Paris, July 1968. And that actually brings us to the end of that essay. Are we stopping at the end of this essay, or are we going to continue with the next letter?
Yeah, we are going to stop now with the end of this essay. And yeah, so that's our reading for the week in the book club. It's thanks for reading this week, Enmas and Alicia. And thanks to everyone who's been watching live on YouTube, letting us know whether or not the sound was bad and stuff. And really, really helpful stuff. So that's I like a lot of the points that he's making in this chapter. I like the sort of idea around I don't know, it's like something that I've heard Cornel West talk about is sort of like the difference between individuality and individualism. He sort of uses the language of individualism here because he's thinking sort of through like a libertarian socialist perspective. And I feel like a lot of what he's talking about is sort of like individuality, like the variation amongst people, the each of our individual capacities to do our own sort of distinct things and lead our own path, as something that like people are rightful to criticize doesn't exist meaningfully underneath a neoliberal capitalist society. But we have that doesn't mean that individuality itself is something that's bad. It's actually the opposite. Individuality is like part of this human cultural flourishing that would be part and parcel of any sort of useful revolution. And I also like his sort of reflections on how these so-called, like these vanguard parties, these revolutionary organizations, not just vanguard parties, but just any, like all the revolutionary organizations in France, weren't excited by this happening, weren't excited by this sort of like spontaneous outburst of, like countercultural political push. His experience with that, I think it's an interesting read, for sure. Any thoughts on the reading this week before we before we wrap up the stream?
I don't know. I don't know if I have like an overall chapter summary or takeaway, but one thing that I found really exciting in this reading, because I did enjoy it, there's a lot of parts that I can see some interesting parallels to what's going on right now. And the beginning with, they were talking about, honestly, I don't remember exactly what they were talking about because I did not highlight or make notes or whatever, but I had a thought about music and Nina Simone. She covered a track by the Beatles, and it was really cool. But unfortunately, I don't fucking remember what that song was called. Oh, Revolution, like the Revolution song. They're talking about the Beatles version of the Revolution versus the way that Nina Simone changed it to sound like it reflected her experience as a revolutionary in the US. I need to shut up. I'm really sorry. I'm not sure what I should be contributing right now.
Hey, no worries. No bad things to contribute. I thought that this piece was 20 pages long, but it turns out it's both combined are 20 pages total. So we're just debating in the chat whether or not to wrap it up this week and do the second half. I'm kind of tempted to do it. Are you all down?
Yeah, I just need to refill my water, and yeah, then I'll be down.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do this spontaneously, like the May June events in France. Like, let's just spontaneously outburst doing 2 chapters because they turned out to be a lot shorter. Just like we've spontaneously split longer chapters because of a truly anarchist lack of foresight. We're responding to the revolutionary conditions.
And while we're waiting for these revolutionary conditions to be ripe, we can get back to the music. We can put on the Nina Simone cover of Revolution.
Can you put it on?
I don't know how to share things. I've never done that before. I guess this is a good learning moment if we're not doing anything else. So, do I just open it in my browser?
I think we can't pull it off right now. But if you put the link in the channel there, I'll throw it in the comments.
That is 700 times more reasonable. I think this is it. For the record, I didn't listen beforehand to this specific version.
So, that's part of what, not only do you get great classic readings of texts, texts from history that have some relevance to the modern condition. You also get to hear us discuss whether or not we'll do 1 or 2 chapters and the technical limitations of the setup we have. I think without further ado, maybe what I'll do is I'll just start hopping into the May June events in France part 2, the second 10-page chapter, where he's discussing the same issue, and we'll discuss both chapters at the book club this next week on Wednesday. So on Wednesdays we have the book club at 7:23 GMT. So that's you can check where it fits into your time zone. There's a guide on the Library Socialist wiki to sort of roughly figure out your time zone, which you can find linked in the description of this video. And if you want to discuss the stuff that's talked about this week, you can join us there with others, and we'll be running 2 groups of people talking about the chapters that we've read this week. So if you listen to the stream, then you got the information that you need to be involved in the discussion. We also try to make it sort of open-ended, so if there's other people who are interested in talking and haven't had a chance to listen or do the reading, there's ways for everyone to participate, and it's usually a pretty cool, like, learning from each other experience, and everyone's super nice, and it's great. So highly recommend that. So without further ado, the May June events in France, part 2, excerpts from a letter. The making of a revolution. What happened and what could have happened. You ask how the May June revolt could have developed into a successful social revolution. I shall try to give you my own views as clearly as possible. My answer applies not only to France, but to any industrialized country in the world. For what happened in France could be regarded as a model of social revolution in any advanced bourgeois country today. It astonishes me that there's so little discussion about France in the United States. The May June events are the first really clear illustration of how a revolution can unfold in an industrial developed country in the present historical period, and they should be studied with the greatest care. The general strike, let me point out, occurred not only because of the wage grievances that were piling up in France, but also, and mainly in my opinion, because the people were fed up. Intuitively, unconsciously, and often quite consciously, the strikers were disgusted with the whole system, and they showed it in countless ways. A cartoon published in France after the May June events shows a CGT official addressing the strikers. "What do you want?" he shouts. "Better pay? Shorter hours? Longer vacations?" Each time this Stalinist hack asks one of the questions, the strikers respond with silence. Finally, the CGT official cries out in anger, "Tell me, damn it! I'm your representative!" And the strikers answer with a huge cry, "We want the revolution!" To a very large extent, this response is accurate. The cartoon expressed the sentiment which was still very diffuse, but of course was nevertheless quite real. That's why the cartoon was so popular in France when it came out. It expressed what many workers, especially young workers, felt in a vague way, and perhaps not so vaguely.
The student barricades of May 10 precipitated the general strike, the largest general strike in history. The workers, mainly the young workers, said to themselves, quote, "If the students can do it, so can we." And out of the Sud Aviation, I think that one is supposed to be pronounced in French, the Sud Aviation plant in Nantes, a city with the strongest anarcho-syndicalist tendencies in France, came the general strike. The strike swept into Paris and brought out almost everybody, not only industrial workers. Insurance employees went out, as well as postal workers, department store clerks, professionals, teachers, scientific researchers. Yes, even the football players took over the building of their professional association and put out a banner that proclaimed, "Football belongs to the people!" It was not only a workers' strike, it was a people's strike that cut across almost all class lines. You must understand this, for it is a very important fact about the possibilities of our time. At Nantes, peasants brought their tractors into the city to help the movement, and longshoremen emptied the holds of the ships to feed the strikers. The most advanced demands, I should emphasize, were raised in the newer industries, for example, in the electronics plants. In one such plant, a firm composed largely of highly skilled technicians, the employees declared publicly, quote, "We have everything we want. We won large wage increases and longer vacations in negotiations we conducted last month, April. We are now striking for only one demand, workers' control of industry, and not only in our plant, but for all the plants in France."
What an astonishing development. And this demand was precisely the key to the whole situation. The workers had occupied the plants. The economy was in their hands. Whether the sweeping movement would become complete social revolution depended upon one thing. Would the workers not only occupy the plants, but work them? This was the barrier that had been surmounted. Had the workers begun to work the plants under workers' management, the revolt would have advanced into full-scale social revolution. Now let us try to imagine what would have happened if the workers had actually surmounted this barrier. Each plant would elect its own factory committee from among its own workers to administer the plant. Here the workers could have counted on a great deal of cooperation from the technical staff, most of whom would have gone over to the revolution. I emphasize, quote, administer, because policy would have been made by the workers in the plant by assembly of the workers on the factory floor. The factory committee would merely execute and coordinate these policies. Here you have true revolutionary democracy, and in the arena of production where the means of life are made. Let us go further, and what I shall describe as absolutely possible. The factory committees of all the local plants could now link together to form an area administrative council, whose function would be to deal with whatever supply problems exist. Each member of this council would be rigorously controlled by the workers in the plant from which he or she came, and would be fully accountable to the factory assembly. The task of the council, I must emphasize, would be entirely administrative. Many of its technical functions could be taken over by computers, and membership of the council would be rotated as often as possible. Together with these industrial forms of organization, there would also be neighborhood organizations. assemblies corresponding to the French Revolutionary sections of 1793, as well as action committees to perform the administrative tasks of the neighborhood assemblies. They too would form an administrative council, which would work with the factory committee council, the two meeting together periodically to deal with common problems. One of the most important functions of the neighborhood assemblies, the new sections, quote, would be to recycle employment from non-productive areas of the economy, sales, insurance, advertising, quote, government, and other socially useless areas into productive areas. The goal here would be to shorten the work week as rapidly as possible. In this way, everyone would benefit almost immediately from the new arrangement of society. Both the industrial worker and, say, the ex-salesman whom the worker trains in the factory. All would get the means of life for a fraction of the time they devote to work under bourgeois conditions. The revolution would thus undercut the position of many counter-revolutionary elements whom from time immemorial have argued that old conditions of life were better than the new.
What is essential here is not the fine detail of this structure, which could be worked out in practice, but the dissolution of power into the assemblies, both factory and neighborhood. In the past, very little attention has been given to the role and importance of unmediated relations in popular assemblies. So strongly was the notion of, quote, representation fixed in the thinking of revolutionary groups and people that the assemblies, where they existed, arose almost accidentally. Apart from the Greek ecclesia, they emerged in most cases as the result, not as the result of conscious design, but rather of fortuitous circumstances. Ordinarily, the various councils and committees in earlier revolutions were given enormous powers in formulating policy. The demarcation between administrative work and policy decisions was murky at best, or simply non-existent. As a result, the committees and councils became social agencies exercising enormous political powers over society. They became a nascent state apparatus that rapidly acquired control over society as a whole. This can now be avoided, partly by making all committees and councils directly answerable to assemblies, partly by using the new technology to shorten the work week radically, thereby freeing the whole people for active participation in the management of society. At first, the various committees, councils, and assemblies would use the existing mechanisms of supply and distribution to meet the material needs of society. Steel would come to Paris the way it always has, by means of the same ordering methods and same railways and trucks, probably operated by the same engineers and truck drivers. The postal, cable, and telephone networks that were used before the revolution to request materials would be used again after the revolution. Finally, finished goods would be distributed by the same warehouses and retail outlets, except that the cash registers would be removed. That tickles me. I just like, we're gonna do the same thing except no cash registers this time. The principal functions of the new factory committee councils and neighborhood councils would be to deal with any bottlenecks and obstructive practices that might emerge and to propose changes that would lead to a more rational use of existing resources.
Well, we're in the 60s, so, or I'm not sure when it began.
Yeah, late 60s, I think 68.
Yeah. Capitalism has already established the physical mechanism of circulation, of distribution and transportation that is needed to maintain society without any state apparatus. This physical mechanism of circulation can be vastly improved upon, to be sure, but it would still be as workable the day after the revolution as it was the day before the revolution. It needs no police, jails, armies, or courts to maintain it. The state is superimposed on this technical system of distribution and actually serves to distort it by maintaining an artificial system of scarcity. This, today, is the real meaning of the sanctity of property. I must emphasize again that since we are concerned with human needs, not with profit, a vast number of people who are needed to operate the profit system could be freed from their idiotic work. So could many people who are occupied with working for the state. These people could join their brothers and sisters in productive jobs, thus drastically shortening everyone's work week. In this new system, The producers and the community could jointly manage the economy from below, coordinating their administrative operations through factory committees, councils of factory committee representatives, and neighborhood action committees, all directly accountable to the plant, and neighborhood assemblies, all recallable to their actions. At this point, society takes direct control of its affairs. The state, its bureaucracy, its armies, police, judges, and jails can disappear. You may object that the old system of production and distribution is still centralized structurally and based on a national division of labor. Agreed, you are perfectly correct, but does its control have to be centralized? As long as policy is made from below, and everyone who executes that policy is controlled locally. Administration is socially decentralized, although the means of production are structurally fairly centralized as yet. A computer used to coordinate the operations of a vast plant, for example, is an instrument for structural centralization. However, if the people who program and operate the computer are completely answerable to the workers in the plant, their operations are socially decentralized.
To pass from a narrow analogy to the broader problems of administration, let us suppose that a board of highly qualified technicians is established to propose changes in the steel industry. This board, we may suppose, advances proposals to rationalize the industry by closing some plants and expanding operations of others in different parts of the country. Is this a, quote, centralized body or not? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, only in the sense that the board is dealing with the problems that concern the country as a whole. No, because it can make no decisions that must be executed for the country as a whole. The board's plan must be examined by all the workers in the plants that are to be closed down and those whose operations are to be expanded. The plan itself may be accepted, modified, or simply rejected. The board has no power to enforce, quote, decisions. It merely offers recommendations. Additionally, its personnel are controlled by the plant in which they work and the locality in which they live. Similar boards, I may add, could be established to plan the physical decentralization of the society. Boards comprised of ecologists as well as technologists. They could develop plans for entirely new patterns of land use in different areas of the country. Like the technicians who are dealing with the existing steel industry, they would have no decision-making powers. The adoption, modification, or rejection of their plans would rest entirely with the communities involved. But I've already traveled too much into this, quote, future. Let us return to May June events of 1968. What of de Gaulle, the generals, the army, the police? Here we come to another crucial problem that faced the May June revolt. Had the armament of workers not merely occupied the arms factories, but worked them to arm the revolutionary people, had the railroad workers transported these arms to the revolutionary people in the cities, towns, and villages, had the action committees organized armed militias, then the situation in France would have changed drastically. An armed people organizing a militia by its own action committees, and there are plenty of reservists among the young people to train them, would have confronted the state. Most of the militants I spoke to do not believe the bulk of the army, composed overwhelmingly of conscripts, would have fired on the people. If the people were armed, every street could have been turned into a bastion and every factory into a fortress. Whether de Gaulle's most reliable troops would have marched upon them in these circumstances is very questionable. Alas, the situation was never brought to that point, the point that every revolution has to risk.
Let me emphasize again that all I have sketched out for you was perfectly possible. I write here of a reality that stared the French revolutionaries in the face. All that was necessary for the workers to work the factories and turn their strike committees into factory committees. This decisive step was not taken. Hence, the people were not armed and the bourgeois system of property relations was not shattered. The Stalinists shrewdly deflected the revolutionary movement into political lines by calling for a communist-socialist coalition cabinet. Thus, the struggle was channeled into an election campaign on strictly bourgeois grounds. For these reasons and others, the revolt receded, and in doing so produced a backlash from the mass of people who were watching and waiting. These people might have been won to the revolution had it succeeded. They seemed to be standing by and saying, "Let's see what you can do." Once the revolt failed, however, they voted for de Gaulle. De Gaulle had at least had reality. The revolution, on the other hand, had been vaporized by failure. How did the Maoists and Trotskyists, the vanguard Bolshevik parties, and groupuscles, Bolshevik parties and groupuscles behave? The Maoists opposed every demand for workers' control. Some of them, after the revolt receded, began to revise their views and are now called anarcho-Maoists. Chairman Mao had opined that workers' control is anarcho-syndicalism, hence a petty bourgeois deviation. The job of the workers, cried the Maoists, was to seize state power. Thus, in the name of Bolshevik realism, the only basis for social revolution, the occupation of the factories, was subordinated to abstract political slogans that had no reality in the living situation. Let me give you an example. Marching to the Ballancourt plant of Renault, the Maoists carried a big banner which read, "Vive the CGT." This at a time when the most revolutionary workers were carrying on a bitter struggle with the CGT and were trying to shed the bureaucratic apparatus with which the Labor Federation had saddled the workers. What the Maoists were saying was, put us in control of the CGT. But who the hell wanted them? The Trotskyists? Which ones? The FER? The JCR? This is some niche beef. This is some stuff that's not relevant to the modern day. But I mean, okay, sorry. It's very relevant to the modern day, and I'll just continue. Who the hell wanted them? Who the hell wanted the Maoists in control of the CGT? The Trotskyists? Which ones? The FER? The JCR? The other 2 or 3 splits? The FER played an overtly counter-revolutionary role at almost every decisive point, condemning all the street actions that led to the general strike as adventuristic. The students had their hands full with them in the street fighting before the Sorbonne, where they tried to get the students to go home, and the barricade fighting the night of May 10th, when the Maoists denounced the students as, quote, romantics. Instead of joining the students, Maoists held mass meetings at the Mutualite. All of this did not prevent the FER from politicking like mad in the corridors and assembly meetings of the Sorbonne after the students had succeeded. As to the JCR, more often than not, they dragged their feet and created a great deal of confusion in the Sorbonne assembly with their politicking. Toward the end of the May June events, they held back the movement and accommodated themselves to the non-Stalinist electoral left. What was, quote, missing in the May June events? Certainly not vanguard Bolshevik parties. The revolt was afflicted with parties like these, like lice. What was needed in France was an awareness among the workers that the factories had to be worked, not merely occupied or struck. Or to put it differently, what the revolt lacked was a movement that could develop this consciousness in the workers. Such a movement would have to have been anarchic, similar either to the March 22nd movement or the action committees that took over Sensier and tried to help the workers, not dominate them. Had these movements developed before the revolt, or had the revolt lasted long enough for them to develop an impressive propaganda and action force, events might have taken a different turn. Anyway, the communists combined with de Gaulle to deflect the revolt and finally destroy it. In my opinion, these are the real lessons of the May June events. In reading what I have written, it becomes very clear why Marxist-Leninists in America devote little discussion to the May June events in France. The events, even the memory of them, challenge all their tenets, programs, and strategies. Paris, July 1968. That line about lice cracked me up.
There was a lot of good lines in this. The line about not eating a cash register. I'm glad I wasn't on a mic because I was dying.
Oh yeah, just the thought of being like, well, I mean, and it makes sense too for the first step of a revolution too. Like for the first step of the revolution, you would want to keep as much stuff as possible that people like, you know. And the point that he makes in this part of the chapter about one of the immediate tenets of a revolutionary transition program is to return to people to work at less hours. And just immediately, because it's something that we know is possible. We know that it works, and we know that there's ways to do that, and basically like put people more to work and increase productivity in the hours that people are actually there. instead of people like slacking off for part of the day because it's not natural to work for 8 hours straight in the way that like biorhythms work in human beings, and like resentment towards bosses. I mean, I love this. I've never read this part of this book before, and I love some of the points that he makes here around, the immediate shortening of the workday, it returning to work and just being like immediately giving people a better life with a higher quality of life, and then the dunks on all these weird specific like Maoist and Marxist-Leninist sects from France in the late 1960s. There's some funny lines in there, but also just like the general principle of being like this was a potential revolution, and there were people there who allegedly like wanted a revolution but couldn't see it and sort of like worked against it. I think it's a harsh criticism that I think needs to be accounted for in organizing along these lines. Like the fact that these Maoist groups called the potential sort of like preconditions of a revolt, like these moments of revolts that could have led to revolution, and the fact that there were people there calling it adventurous and saying that it wasn't revolutionary enough and stuff. I think there is a real problem there that is worth criticizing. Like when I said this is no longer relevant, I immediately realized it's how profoundly relevant this is, even though I don't know what the FER and the JC are like. I have interacted with people who are in organizations that have new combinations of 3 letters that would probably do similar things.
Well, what's weird is this is what, 25, 30 years after Catalonia, and it faced the same issues from what I gather. I haven't read much on Catalonia yet because I'm a slacker, but it seems like the dividedness of leadership really kind of killed it. And this completely makes sense that it's on the IWW site now.
I guess you could sort of pull on a type of contradiction in that. No, wait, actually it's not really. So I'll tell you what I thought the contradiction was, and then I'll just explain why I think it's actually not a contradiction. But I was thinking of like Bookchin is sort of calling for these specific things like shortening of the workday, democratic assemblies and stuff. He's got sort of the start of a coherent and reasonable description of how to make a revolutionary transition through revolt, like cultural revolt type events like we saw in May 68 or during Occupy, that go across classes and go even across sort of like ideologies or whatever, and like these outpourings of sort of like lumpen revolts. And at the same time, he's calling for sort of a specific program, or at least the framework of a program that he's like, I think this would work and this would work to do this. And I think his prescriptions are pretty strong. Like strong as in would be effective. I think that there's a real strong, powerful logic to what he's expressing here. It's a reasonable set of ideas, like he said, on how you would transition. And I was thinking, well, he's criticizing the people who want to steer, and then at the same time he's sort of providing a roadmap of what he thinks the steering should go like. And isn't there sort of a contradiction there? But I think it's actually not a contradiction if we approach it from recognizing that there's an integrative, so like the purpose of the facilitator within anarchism is not strictly to be a leader. It's to develop potentialities amongst everyone, like develop the so like the leader of an anarchist group, quote, leader, is a facilitator, and they're not above other people. They just play a different role. It's different. It's not hierarchical. It's different. And what they do is they ensure that there's a stack. They ensure that everyone gets a chance to talk. They ensure that people are listened to, that certain people don't take up too much space or too little space, that people stay on topic. and come to conclusions together. That's sort of facilitating, making sure that the process has the correct, to make sure the process is working correctly to bring the best out of everyone, and come to conclusions for problems as a group. That process of facilitation, that process of facilitating group democracy through group reason, like group dialectical passing of ideas, moving to greater levels of reasonability and ethics through the group process of reason by comparing different people's perspectives and coming to sort of synthesis positions and so on. Like that process requires work to preserve. And that process is what sort of Bookchin calls for along certain sort of principles, like setting up the principles ahead of time and knowing roughly like what our ethical framework is the precondition for doing this. But then once you have the ethical framework to say, like, i.e., we need to get to a consensus or not, or we need to have a majority, like in a lot of anarchist groups, they need to come to consensus. And that's a precondition before the meeting. They don't have a vote on whether or not to come to consensus. Like that's a precondition. So the preconditions are like the sort of, almost like the constitution, or the guiding principles of an organization. And if you set up those guiding principles, the jobs of the closest thing to that anarchist groups have to, quote, leaders, like a truly social anarchist group would avoid having leaders except in very informal senses, from like maybe one guy knows a lot about boots. He's a boot maker. You might ask him to lead the boot subcommittee because he has some knowledge that people would follow, but he doesn't have the ability to have authority over those people. In the sense that he could like cast them out or something because they go against his boot thoughts.
In my experience, we say bottom liners a lot. So if we're coming to consensus in a meeting, and this is where I would actually ask about whether we are going to continue with this on the YouTube stream or how long the YouTube stream is going to be. We finished the reading. Are we going to do a bit of a discussion on the stream? I just don't want to be responsible for making somebody listen to me talk for 3 hours.
Oh yeah, no, I think we're talking a little bit informally here at the end, and we're gonna wrap up shortly.
Yeah, well, okay. I do enjoy the way Sean breaks things down here. So
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that's what I was thinking about with again, sorry to invite myself back into the conversation. In my experience with different anarchist organizing groups, we do bottom liners where it's that person might have more experience or just more capacity to take on a certain task. And then they're kind of I don't know what words like people use or what just comes from weird like corporate meeting rooms, but like having that being the person, the touch point person or whatever that organizes, coordinates getting that task done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Go ahead, Sean.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say totally. Like that's very, very similar to. I think there's some underlying principles between facilitators and bottom liners that you could sort of like maybe pull apart the differences slightly, but it's the same sort of principle. Like bottom liner is facilitating multiple people participating in it, but it also has this sort of sense of there's almost like a duocratic vibe to bottom liner. Like the idea is almost that if someone is a bottom liner,
can you explain it?
Oh yeah. So like duocracy is sort of the idea that people can lead by doing rather than like having, it's like an ask for forgiveness, not permission culture.
Shit, yeah.
So like a duocracy would be like in Rick Falkvinge, the founder of the Swedish Pirate Party, it's an electoral organization. But I think there's an anarchist sort of principle behind it, is like there's something called the 3 pirate rule, or there was at one point in the early stages, which is that if 3 people agree on something that are all members of the organization and in good standing or whatever, they're not disciplinary, they haven't been disciplined or something, that they can just do a project themselves and that they become the boss, that the sort of boss as it were of that project at that time, because there's also sort of a thing in anarchism, like it's the abolition of bosses, but it's also in a sense making everyone a boss.
Yeah, totally.
All gods, all masters, in a way.
I used to say, this is probably not relevant, jack of all trades, master of none, but like emphasis on master of none. We all kind of do what we can and help each other out, get the shit done, do the work, but without necessarily, like, I don't feel like I'm an expert at anything, but I appreciate having access to groups where like everyone's contributions are valued. For example, again, off topic or very specific example, even within this Discord server, the way that conversations happen and go in very different directions based on who is participating in those conversations. Like at book clubs where certain characters are present or not, we can explore lots of different angles of the reading that we're doing. Based on who is bottom lining that conversation. We all lift together. Plays in the background. Yep.
Oh man, if you haven't heard it, there's a really great 10-hour loop of it on YouTube. Oh, it's so good.
Have you ever listened to it all the way through?
We all live together? No, well, there are times when it's probably been on in the background, like I walked away from it, but
yeah, that's awesome.
I mean, it's the 2.5 minutes that it normally is just isn't long enough.
Yeah, 10 hours of sitting in front of a speaker listening to the same song is a pretty big commitment.
I don't know. I used to do dubstep shows as an audio engineer, so I mean, it's pretty much that.
Nice. I come from the punk rock line, wherein we also did power violence and songs like, I can't name any right now, but the attention span can sometimes be very short. We like big bursts of activity, followed by brief rests.
Oh yeah, so the facilitator and sort of duocracy line, bringing it back to what I was saying before, is this not actually a contradiction in Bookchin, because what he's advocating for is the preconditions coming to the preconditions that would allow for people to individually flourish and develop their sort of like political consciousness, their revolutionary identity together. So reducing the workday is a great example of that, where it's elevated as like it's sort of like a transitionary condition to a more liberated society, to increase people's realm of freedom, to increase the amount of time in the day that people are able to freely work on what they want to work on, rather than what they have to work on in order to have their basic needs be met. So go ahead.
I
was just gonna say there isn't a contradiction there, because he's talking about creating the conditions. He's talking about basically facilitation and bottom lining, but also making sure that as many people as possible can be part of the process of transitioning and building a better society together. First starting with keeping everything going except for the cash registers.
Oh, that bit still cracks me up. It's so good.
That point was pretty funny. Very specific. Very narrow-sighted. Like, you're not gonna stop capitalism if you take away its cash registers.
Well, it's a good start.
Yep. Well, even the reason.
What about it though? Like, they're actually taking away cash registers now. You can go to a restaurant and there's only an iPad there, and you have to pay with cards. Technically, no cash register.
That's true.
I know it's different. There's no cash.
Yeah, we shouldn't take away cash registers without adjectives. We should take away cash registers as part of a revolutionary program towards the abolition of petty cash exchange in exchange for basic needs. and the decommodification of life.
Yes, thank you, Sean. That's what I meant. That was what I wanted to say.
It's important, and I think it's a good point. So yeah, this has been our reading for the week on the two parts of the May June events in France, so join us for our discussion groups on Discord next Wednesday to talk about this chapter. At 7 GMT and 23 GMT. If you are on the West Coast like me, that means the first of those two meetings is at midnight, and the second is 4 p.m. on Wednesday, midnight on Tuesday, 4 p.m. next day. But if you're somewhere else in the world, it could be any old combination. So come to whichever one you can. There's great people at every group. And really interesting discussions. I can't speak highly enough about the group of people, how nice they are, and what insights they have. It's been like super edifying for me to participate in, and I hear the same from other people as well, that it's just like a very fun thing to be a part of. And you're invited. So send us a message if you want to get an invite to the Discord server to be part of the book club. We're happy to let you in. And thanks for everyone who's watched on the stream. Any last words before we sign off, folks? On behalf of all of us, goodbye. Have a wonderful day. Take care. We wish the best, and let's build a remake society to work for everyone, an ecological, rational society where people are paid according to need. You have a commune of communes, and you abolish patriarchy, decolonize, and all that other good stuff, end property relations as they currently stand. There's a lot of great stuff that we could do. Free intellectual property, tubes, sorting, you name it. It's going to be wonderful. And check out my podcast at seriouslyWrong.com, SRSLYWRONG.com. Where it's not readings, but it's actually it's more of a show. So that's worth checking out. I assume everyone who's listening to this is already aware of that. Take care.
Yeah, I wonder if there are folks who are going to discover Seriously Wrong through the book club.
Well,
open to it.
I hope so. Yeah.
That's the goal. Yeah.
And the book club through Seriously Wrong. That's called the
yes.
sum greater than the sum of its parts.
Nice.